How does a respected deputy, pregnant with her partner's child, end up standing over his body with a smoking gun? When does protecting your future become a crime that destroys it? And what drives someone who once upheld the law to take justice into their own hands? Welcome to True Crime Stories Archive, where we dare to venture into the shadows of human nature. I'm your guide through these dark corridors of true crime, bringing you stories that challenge our understanding of right and wrong. If you're new here, join our growing community of truth seekers by hitting that subscribe button. Together, we'll explore cases that prove reality is often more chilling than fiction.
So this one's going to be a little bit different.
A little bit.
We got a case here that's
Yeah, this is ripped from the headlines kind of stuff.
absolutely shooting of Terrell Douglas by off-duty police officer Jova Jackson.
I know it sounds like every other story we hear these days.
Yeah, kind of a familiar
But
note.
this one has some twists and turns.
Let's lay it out. Georgia, June 4th, 2023. We have Jova Jackson, this decorated officer, standing there gun in hand, and Terrell Douglas, her ex-partner.
Okay, so already a lot going on.
Right.
Ex-partner.
Also, father of her unborn child is dead.
Oh, wow.
Heavy stuff, right?
So many layers. I mean, where do we even begin?
I know that.
Like you said, decorated officer, we automatically think good guy protector.
Right, upholding the law.
But now she's a suspect.
Potentially a perpetrator.
And that's what pasted text really hits on in the beginning, is this question of survival or revenge.
In the fall of 2015, the Rockdale County Sheriff's Office welcomed a promising new recruit. At just 23, Jova Jackson stood out immediately, not for her youth, but for an innate ability to command respect while maintaining compassion. The halls of the county jail, where she began as a detention deputy, would become the training ground for what many believed would be an exemplary career in law enforcement. Unlike many of her peers who viewed their detention officer roles as mere stepping stones, Jova approached every shift with remarkable dedication. Her colleagues noticed how she could defuse volatile situations with just her presence and a few carefully chosen words. This wasn't just a job for her, it was a calling. Within the austere walls of Rockdale County Jail, Jova Jackson didn't just perform her duties, she excelled at them. Her approach to handling inmates demonstrated a rare combination of firmness and empathy that set her apart. Where others saw troublemakers, she saw human beings, yet never at the expense of security or protocol. This distinctive approach caught the attention of her superiors, who recognized something special in the young deputy. By her second year, stories circulated about how she prevented a near riot in Block C through sheer force of personality, talking down an agitated inmate when others were reaching for their restraints. These weren't just workplace anecdotes, they were testament to her growing reputation. March 2019 marked a pivotal milestone when the department named her Employee of the Month. The commendation cited not just her exemplary service record, but her initiative in developing new de-escalation protocols that would later be adopted throughout the facility. Her superiors noted how she transformed some of the most challenging sections of the jail into model units of compliance and order. The natural progression of Jova's career led her to become a jail training officer, a position that allowed her natural leadership abilities to shine. New recruits found in her a mentor who didn't just teach procedures, but instilled principles. Watch how she handles herself, supervisors would tell rookies. That's how it's done. Her transition to school resource officer revealed yet another facet of her capabilities. In the hallways of Rockdale County schools, Officer Jackson became known as someone who could connect with troubled youth, often intervening before minor infractions could escalate into serious offenses. Parents would specifically request her presence at difficult meetings, knowing she could bridge the gap between authority and understanding. By January 2023, when she pinned on the corporal's stripes, Jova Jackson had built more than a career. She'd crafted a legacy of service that seemed destined for even greater heights. Her personnel file bulged with commendations, each one a stepping stone on what appeared to be an unstoppable ascent through the ranks. But beneath the polished surface of professional achievement, circumstances were aligning that would test every principle Jova had sworn to uphold. Enter Terrell Douglas, a man whose very presence in her life would raise eyebrows and eventually sound alarms throughout the department. Their paths first crossed during what seemed like a routine encounter, but something about their interaction defied the usual boundaries between law enforcement and those on the other side of the law. Terrell, with his extensive criminal record, represented everything Jova had dedicated her life to controlling, yet something about him drew her in, creating the first hairline fracture in her carefully constructed world. The relationship between Jova Jackson and Terrell Douglas began like a spark in a powder keg, subtle at first, but pregnant with destructive potential. Their initial encounters were cloaked in secrecy, stolen moments that seemed harmless until they weren't. For Jova, Terrell represented something raw and real, a stark contrast to the rigid structure of her professional life. Perhaps it was this very contrast that made their connection so intoxicating. But Rockdale County was too small for secrets this big. Whispers began to circulate through the sheriff's office, hushed conversations that fell silent when Jova entered a room. Her colleagues, once eager to share case details and personal stories, began keeping their distance. The change was subtle at first, like water slowly eroding stone. By mid-2019, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Her supervisors, who had once praised her judgment, now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of questioning it. The first formal reprimand landed on her desk like a thunderbolt, official documentation of her inappropriate association with a known felon. Your relationship with Mr. Douglas compromises not only your position but the integrity of this department, the document stated in stark, bureaucratic language. But for Jova, these words represented more than a professional rebuke. They were a demand to choose between her heart and her badge. The investigation that followed was thorough and unforgiving. Every aspect of her relationship with Terrell came under scrutiny. Security camera footage was reviewed, showing their encounters in public places. Phone records were examined. Fellow officers were interviewed. The weight of this scrutiny began to show in Jova's performance, creating small cracks in her once impeccable service record. Yet even as her professional world began to crumble, Jova clung to her relationship with Terrell. She began to rationalize, to see herself as someone who could bridge two worlds, law enforcement and redemption. Perhaps she could be the one to help him turn his life around. This belief became her anchor, even as it dragged her deeper into troubled waters. The suspension that followed in late 2019 should have been a wake-up call. Instead, it became the catalyst for an even deeper commitment to Terrell. Stripped of her badge, even temporarily, Jova found herself adrift, and Terrell's presence became her new North Star. The irony was lost on no one. The very relationship that had cost her so much professionally now seemed to be the only thing keeping her afloat personally. By 2022, when Jova resumed her relationship with Terrell after a brief separation, the dynamics had shifted dramatically. She was no longer the rising star of the department, but a cautionary tale. Yet something had hardened in her during this time, a determination that bordered on defiance. She seemed to wear her relationship with Terrell like armor, protecting herself from the judgmental stares of her former admirers. Late 2022 brought a new complication that would forever alter the trajectory of their volatile relationship: Jova's pregnancy. What should have been a moment of joy instead cast long shadows of uncertainty. The news rippled through the department like a shockwave, transforming workplace whispers into open conversations about her judgment and fitness for duty. But as Jova's belly swelled with new life, her relationship with Terrell began to show dangerous fissures. The man who had once seemed worth sacrificing everything for started revealing a different face. Missed appointments at prenatal checkups, unanswered calls that stretched into days. The steady drip of disappointment began to erode her fierce loyalty. Then came the rumors, whispered accounts of Terrell being seen with other women, stories that reached Jova through the very law enforcement grapevine she had once been part of. Each new revelation was like a knife twist, made sharper by her increasing isolation from her former support system. May 2023 arrived with a cruel finality. The department, tired of the controversy surrounding their once stellar officer, presented Jova with an ultimatum: resignation or termination. The choice was barely a choice at all. With trembling hands, she signed her resignation papers, surrendering not just her badge but the identity she'd spent years building. But this professional death seemed to awaken something darker in Jova. Her pregnancy, now in its second trimester, had become a constant reminder of her vulnerability. Every kick from the child within seemed to mock her circumstances. A child who would be born to a father whose loyalty proved as ephemeral as morning mist. The final weeks of May 2023 saw Jova's world constricting like a noose. Her carefully constructed life had unraveled thread by thread. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid her. Family members' attempts at intervention were met with stony silence. She began tracking Terrell's movements with an intensity that bordered on obsession, noting his patterns, his habits, the places he frequented. The woman who had once been known for her steady composure now exhibited flashes of unpredictable behavior. Neighbors reported seeing her car parked outside Terrell's residence at odd hours. Text messages recovered later would show an escalating pattern of emotional turmoil, alternating between desperate pleas for attention and dark hints of retribution. The morning of June 4, 2023, dawned with deceptive tranquility. The air hung heavy with early summer humidity, nature oblivious to the tragedy about to unfold. Surveillance footage would later show Jova's vehicle entering Terrell's neighborhood at 5:47 a.m., moving with deliberate slowness, like a predator stalking its prey. What transpired in the minutes before the fatal shot would become a matter of intense legal scrutiny. Neighbors would later report hearing raised voices, though none could clearly make out the words. One witness described seeing Jova and Terrell in what appeared to be an intense discussion near his front porch, their body language speaking volumes about the tension between them. At precisely 6:13 a.m., the crack of a single gunshot shattered the morning silence. The sound echoed off suburban homes, sending birds scattering into the pale Georgia sky. In that instant, the line between protector and perpetrator, between victim and aggressor, blurred beyond recognition. Terrell Douglas fell where he stood, the impact of the bullet leaving no chance for survival. Jova remained motionless, the gun still warm in her grip, her face a mask of emotions too complex to decipher. The woman who had once sworn to protect and serve had become judge, jury, and executioner in one devastating moment. The response was swift. Within minutes, the same department where Jova had once served with distinction descended upon the scene. Former colleagues now approached her with weapons drawn, their commands to drop the weapon, tinged with disbelief and horror. The irony was palpable. The handcuffs that clicked around her wrists were identical to ones she had used countless times before. The crime scene told its own story. Forensics teams meticulously documented every detail: the precise location of the shell casing, the spray pattern of blood on the concrete, the position of Terrell's body. Each piece of evidence would later become part of a complex puzzle that prosecutors would use to reconstruct the events of that fatal morning. In the days that followed, investigators uncovered a digital trail that painted a picture of escalating obsession. Text messages, social media posts, and surveillance footage revealed a woman increasingly consumed by betrayal and desperation. Jova's phone contained hundreds of unanswered messages to Terrell, ranging from heartfelt pleas to chilling warnings. The charging documents landed with devastating weight: malice murder, possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, and stalking. Each charge represented another nail in the coffin of Jova Jackson's freedom. The same courthouse where she had once testified against criminals now became the stage for her own prosecution. The prosecutors painted a damning picture. They spoke of premeditation, presenting evidence of Jova's methodical surveillance of Terrell's movements in the weeks leading up to the shooting. Security footage from local businesses showed her car passing by his frequent haunts. Cell phone tower data tracked her movements, revealing a pattern that suggested something far more calculated than a spontaneous act of passion. Her defense team fought back with a different narrative. They portrayed Jova as a woman betrayed on every level, by the man she loved, by the system she served, by the very community she had protected. They spoke of pregnancy hormones, emotional trauma, and the devastating impact of losing both her career and her support system in rapid succession. This is not a story of premeditated murder, her lead attorney argued in the opening statement. This is the tragedy of a woman pushed beyond human endurance, who saw her entire world crumbling around her while carrying the child of a man who had systematically destroyed her life. The trial split the Rockdale County community in two. Former colleagues from the sheriff's office found themselves torn between loyalty to one of their own and the stark reality of her actions. Some stepped forward to testify about her exemplary service record, while others reluctantly provided evidence of her unraveling in the months leading up to the shooting. Local media coverage was relentless. Every day brought new headlines, new angles, new interpretations of the tragedy. From protector to perpetrator, screamed one newspaper. Love, betrayal, and murder in Rockdale, declared another. Each story seemed to dig deeper into the complexity of a woman who had lived on both sides of the law. In the courtroom, every detail was scrutinized. Ballistics experts testified about the angle of the shot, suggesting Terrell had been facing Jova when she pulled the trigger. Medical examiners spoke clinically about the path of the bullet, the cause of death, the scientific certainty of their findings. But it was the emotional testimony that truly captivated the jury. The prosecution's star witness, a a neighbor who had observed Jova and Terrell's relationship deteriorate, painted a haunting picture of obsession. She described late-night confrontations, tearful arguments in the street, and Jova's car becoming an increasingly common sight in their quiet neighborhood. It was like watching someone disappear into darkness, the witness testified, her words hanging heavy in the courtroom air. Court-appointed psychologists delved deep into Jova's mental state. Their testimony revealed a complex web of emotional trauma, betrayal, and mounting desperation. One expert spoke of catastrophic emotional collapse, the result of losing her identity as a law enforcement officer combined with the vulnerability of pregnancy and the perceived betrayal by Terrell. What we see here, testified Dr. Eleanor Martinez, a forensic psychologist, is not simply a case of jealousy or revenge. We're witnessing the complete dissolution of a person's core identity, leading to actions that would have been unthinkable in their previous life. Jova's defense team presented evidence of Terrell's continuing manipulation of their client. Text messages revealed a pattern of hot and cold behavior, promises made and broken, and emotional manipulation that seemed calculated to keep Jova off balance. They argued that the morning of the shooting, Terrell had made threats about their unborn child that pushed Jova over the edge. She didn't wake up that morning planning to kill, her attorney argued passionately. She woke up desperate to protect the only thing she had left, her unborn child. When Terrell threatened to make sure she'd never raise their baby in peace, something inside her shattered. As the trial progressed, darker aspects of Terrell's character came to light. Former girlfriends testified about his pattern of targeting women in positions of authority, describing how he would systematically break down their defenses and isolate them from their support systems. One former victim, her voice trembling, described how Terrell had nearly destroyed her law career through similar manipulation. These revelations cast new shadows over the case, raising questions about predatory behavior and psychological manipulation. Had Jova been targeted specifically because of her position in law enforcement? Was her downfall orchestrated long before that fatal morning? The prosecution's closing argument was a masterpiece of methodical destruction. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury, his voice steady as he reconstructed the timeline of that fatal morning. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this is not a story of self-defense or maternal protection. This is the calculated execution of a man by a woman who had completely lost her moral compass." He methodically laid out the evidence: the early morning arrival, the weapon brought to the scene, the single shot fired with deadly accuracy, skills honed during her years in law enforcement. Jova Jackson didn't just cross a line, he concluded. She obliterated it, transforming from protector to predator in one irreversible moment. The defense's closing argument painted a starkly different picture. Before you today sits not just Jova Jackson, but every woman who has ever felt trapped, threatened, and abandoned. Her attorney began, her voice resonating with emotion. She stands here carrying not just her unborn child, but the weight of a system that failed her at every turn. They reminded the jury of Jova's years of service, her exemplary record, and the systematic dismantling of her life through her relationship with Terrell. What you're witnessing is not the actions of a cold-blooded killer, but the desperate last stand of a mother protecting her future. For 3 days, the jury grappled with the complexity of the case. Their questions to the judge revealed their struggle. Requests for clarification on the definition of malice murder versus voluntary manslaughter, questions about the legal definition of self-defense, inquiries about how to weigh psychological testimony. The courthouse buzzed with speculation as hours turned into days. Outside, media crews maintained their vigil, while supporters from both sides held quiet demonstrations. Former colleagues from the sheriff's office watched with heavy hearts as they awaited the fate of one of their own. On a rain-soaked Thursday afternoon, the jury finally reached their decision. The courtroom fell silent as Jova Jackson stood, one hand resting protectively over her growing belly, to face her fate. The jury foreman's voice was clear and unwavering. On the count of malice murder, we find the defendant guilty. The judge's chambers had never felt more solemn than during the sentencing hearing. As Jova Jackson stood before the bench, her pregnancy now visibly advanced, the gravity of the moment seemed to press down on everyone present. The judge, who had presided over countless cases where Jova had once testified as an officer, now faced the difficult task of sentencing her. "Ms. Jackson," the judge began, his voice heavy with the weight of his duty, "your case represents one of the most tragic falls from grace this court has ever witnessed. You were once a symbol of law and order, someone young officers looked up to. Now you stand before me as a cautionary tale of how quickly one's moral compass can become devastatingly misaligned. Before pronouncing the sentence, the court heard impact statements. Terrell's mother approached the podium, her grief palpable as she spoke of a son who, despite his flaws, didn't deserve to die. "You didn't just take my son," she said, looking directly at Jova. "You took a father from his unborn child. You turned a miracle into a tragedy." Jova's former supervisor from the sheriff's office also spoke, his testimony a complex mixture of disappointment and compassion. "I watched Jova become one of our finest officers," he stated, his voice thick with emotion. "To see her standing here today, it's like watching a star burn out." When given the opportunity to speak, Jova rose slowly, her handcuffs clinking in the hushed courtroom. "I stand before you today, not seeking forgiveness," she began, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I stand here as someone who lost herself so completely that the line between protection and destruction became invisible. My child will grow up knowing that their mother acted out of desperation, not malice. But that doesn't make it right." The judge's sentence came down like a thunderbolt: life in prison. The possibility of parole would only be considered after 30 years served. The sentence would begin after the birth of her child, allowing Jova a brief period to deliver and arrange for the baby's care before beginning her incarceration. The verdict and sentence sent shockwaves through Georgia's law enforcement community. In police briefing rooms across the state, Jova's story became a sobering reminder of how quickly a decorated officer could fall. Training protocols were revised to include more extensive discussions about personal boundaries and emotional health. Her case became required reading at the police academy, a stark warning about the dangers of crossing professional lines. 3 months after her sentencing, Jova gave birth to a daughter under the watchful eyes of prison guards. The baby, whose name was kept private to protect her future, spent only 48 hours with her mother before being placed in the custody of Jova's sister. The infant's first moments captured the tragic duality of new life emerging from circumstances of death. The case sparked intense debate within legal and law enforcement circles. Questions arose about the adequacy of psychological support for officers, the policies regarding personal relationships, and the unique pressures faced by women in law enforcement. Several police departments across Georgia began implementing more rigorous support systems and counseling services for their officers. Rockdale County found itself forever changed by the tragedy. The community, which had once seen Jova as a symbol of protection and service, now grappled with complex emotions. Local schools where she had served as a resource officer held discussions about trust, betrayal, and the human capacity for both good and evil. The case attracted national attention, spawning documentaries, true crime podcasts, and endless speculation about what really happened that fatal morning. Journalists delved deep into the intersection of law enforcement culture, romantic relationships, and mental health. Books were written, each offering different perspectives on how a decorated officer could transform into a convicted murderer. The years following Jova Jackson's conviction left an indelible mark on everyone involved. The Rockdale County Sheriff's Office implemented sweeping changes in their personnel policies, particularly regarding personal relationships and mental health monitoring. The case became known as the Jackson Protocol, a reminder of how personal and professional lines must never blur in law enforcement. Reports from the Georgia State Prison painted a picture of Jova's life behind bars. The former law enforcement officer now found herself on the other side of the system she once served. Her unique position, a former deputy among inmates, created complex dynamics within the prison population. Some inmates shunned her completely, while others sought her out, curious about her transformation from enforcer to inmate. As her daughter grew under the care of Jova's sister, complex questions emerged about how to explain the truth to a child whose origin story was marked by tragedy. The little girl, who bore a striking resemblance to both her parents, would occasionally appear in local news stories, though her guardians fiercely protected her privacy. Her existence served as a living reminder of how the consequences of that fatal morning would echo through generations. Investigations into Terrell Douglas's life after his death revealed a complex pattern of relationships and manipulations. Other women came forward, sharing stories that created a clearer picture of his impact on vulnerable women in positions of authority. His death, while tragic, sparked important conversations about predatory behavior and the vulnerability of women in law enforcement. Law enforcement psychologists began studying the case as a prime example of how personal and professional boundaries can catastrophically collapse. Dr. Sarah Chen, a leading expert in law enforcement psychology, published a groundbreaking paper titled The Jackson Effect: when protectors become perpetrators, which became required reading in police academies nationwide. The case forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, redemption, and the thin line between duty and darkness. Legal scholars debated whether Jova's background in law enforcement should have been a mitigating or aggravating factor in her sentencing. The case became a touchstone for discussions about how society treats those who fall from positions of trust and authority. From prison, Jova began writing letters to her daughter, to her former colleagues, and eventually to aspiring law enforcement officers. These letters, some of which were published with permission, revealed a woman grappling with the magnitude of her actions. "I didn't just end one life that morning," she wrote. "I derailed countless others, including my own child's future." The Rockdale County Sheriff's Office emerged from the scandal transformed. New psychological screening procedures were implemented. Regular counseling became mandatory for officers, especially those showing signs of personal stress. The department's motto changed to include vigilance in service, vigilance in self, a direct response to the Jackson case. The case reverberated through law enforcement agencies nationwide. Training programs began incorporating more extensive sections on emotional intelligence and boundary maintenance. The Jackson scenario became a standard part of police academy training, used to illustrate how personal relationships can compromise professional judgment. Female officers, in particular, found themselves relating to aspects of Jova's story, though few would openly admit it. Anonymous surveys revealed that many had experienced similar pressures: the challenge of balancing personal relationships with professional duties, the unique vulnerabilities of women in law enforcement, and the constant pressure to prove themselves in a male-dominated field. The story of Jova Jackson transcended the typical true crime narrative, becoming a cultural touchstone that sparked discussions about power, vulnerability, and justice. Television dramas began incorporating elements of her story into their plots, while academic institutions used the case to examine the intersection of gender, authority, and emotional trauma in law enforcement. As Jova served her sentence, her presence in the prison system created unique challenges and opportunities. Some correctional officers, themselves former colleagues in law enforcement, struggled with their role in guarding a former deputy. Her insights into both sides of the justice system made her an object of fascination for criminologists and prison reform advocates. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Jova's imprisonment was her relationship with her daughter. Monthly visits became precious moments of connection, though each reunion ended with the heart-wrenching reality of separation. Through bulletproof glass, she watched her child grow, marking birthdays and milestones from behind bars. The girl's questions became more probing as she aged, forcing both mother and child to confront the complex truth of their family's tragedy. The ripple effects of the case continued to influence policy changes years after the conviction. Police departments across the country began implementing what became known as Jackson indicators, early warning systems designed to identify officers showing signs of emotional distress or boundary issues in their personal lives. The case raised profound questions about the nature of justice and redemption. Could someone who had devoted years to upholding the law find redemption after such a dramatic fall? How does society balance punishment with rehabilitation when the perpetrator was once a guardian of justice? Years after the gunshot that shattered that June morning, Rockdale County remained marked by the tragedy. Local residents who had known Jova as Officer Jackson struggled to reconcile the dedicated public servant with the convicted murderer. The corner where Terrell Douglas fell became an unofficial memorial site, where occasional flowers appeared, some mourning his death, others marking the loss of what Jova Jackson had once represented. Mental health professionals continued to study the case, identifying what they termed the Jackson progression, a pattern of professional compromise leading to personal crisis. Dr. Marcus Reynolds, a leading criminal psychologist, noted in his analysis, "What makes this case particularly compelling is how gradually and completely someone can transition from protector to perpetrator while believing they're still acting in the name of justice." In police academies across Georgia, and eventually nationwide, cadets studied the Jackson case as part of their ethical training. Young officers in training were asked to identify the warning signs, the moments where intervention might have changed the trajectory of events. The hardest part, one instructor noted, is helping them understand how someone so dedicated to the law could end up on the wrong side of it. The case became a cornerstone of law enforcement training, particularly regarding personal boundaries and emotional health. Departments began implementing mandatory counseling sessions and relationship disclosure policies. The phrase, "Remember Jackson," became shorthand for maintaining professional boundaries. Beyond the headlines and policy changes, the human toll continued to mount. Terrell Douglas's family struggled with their loss, while simultaneously grappling with revelations about his pattern of manipulation. Jova's family faced their own challenges, trying to maintain relationships with both their imprisoned daughter and her child, who grew up in the shadow of this tragedy. A decade after the shooting, journalists revisiting the case discovered how deeply it had affected everyone involved. Former colleagues who had testified at the trial spoke about their ongoing struggle with loyalty and duty. One veteran officer reflected, "Every time I train a new deputy, I see shadows of Jova, both who she was and what she became. It's a reminder that none of us is immune to crossing that line if we lose our moral compass." Inside the Georgia State Prison system, Jova Jackson's presence continued to create ripples. She became known as Deputy Down, a nickname that carried both respect and warning. Other inmates, particularly former law enforcement officers serving time, sought her out for guidance on navigating life behind bars. Her unique perspective, having served on both sides of the law, gave her insights that even veteran corrections officers found valuable. As Jova's daughter entered her teenage years, she began her own journey of understanding. Through carefully preserved news clippings, court documents, and family stories, she pieced together the complex puzzle of her origins. Her aunt, who raised her, described watching the girl struggle with her dual heritage. "She has her mother's sense of justice and her father's charisma. Sometimes I see them both in her eyes, and I pray she'll learn from their mistakes rather than repeat them." Universities began incorporating the Jackson case into their criminal justice curriculum. The story became a case study in ethics, psychology, and law enforcement training. Dr. Elizabeth Chun of Harvard Law School noted in her analysis, "The Jackson case represents a perfect storm of institutional failure, personal tragedy, and systemic blind spots. It forces us to question our assumptions about who protects the protectors." The case catalyzed sweeping changes in law enforcement agencies nationwide. Departments implemented what became known as the Jackson Safeguards, comprehensive protocols designed to identify and support officers showing signs of personal crisis. Regular psychological evaluations became mandatory, and departments established anonymous support hotlines for officers struggling with personal relationships. From her prison cell, Jova began documenting her story in a series of journals that would later be published with court approval. Her writings revealed a tormented soul trying to understand her own transformation. "The line between right and wrong didn't disappear in an instant," she wrote. "It eroded slowly, like water wearing away stone, until I couldn't remember where it had been." The case's influence extended to a new generation of law enforcement officers. Training academies developed specific modules addressing the Jackson scenario. Recruits were taught to recognize the warning signs not just in others, but in themselves. The mantra became, "Your badge is your responsibility, but your humanity is your vulnerability." Mental health professionals working with law enforcement identified what they termed post-Jackson syndrome, a heightened awareness among officers about the potential consequences of personal relationships. Some officers reported becoming overly cautious in their personal lives, fearing they might follow a similar path to destruction. The story continued to captivate the public imagination. Documentary filmmakers, true crime writers, and podcasters returned to the case repeatedly, each finding new angles to explore. One award-winning documentary, Badge and Betrayal, The Jova Jackson Story, earned acclaim for its nuanced examination of how power, love, and duty can become fatally entangled. In the end, the case of Jova Jackson left society grappling with questions that had no easy answers. How does someone sworn to uphold the law become its violator? Where is the line between protection and possession, between justice and revenge? The tragedy forced law enforcement agencies, mental health professionals, and society at large to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the complex interplay between power, love, and duty. Today, Jova Jackson's name serves as both a cautionary tale and a catalyst for change. Her story is taught in police academies, discussed in psychology classes, and debated in law schools. The child she never got to raise grows up carrying the weight of her parents' choices, while the system she once served continues to evolve in response to her tragic fall. In the quiet halls of the Georgia State Prison, a former deputy who once embodied the promise of law enforcement now serves as a living reminder of how quickly authority can transform into tragedy. Her story continues to echo through the justice system, a testament to the fragile nature of human judgment and the devastating consequences when personal boundaries collapse. For those who seek to understand the complex intersection of duty, desire, and destruction, the case of Jova Jackson remains an enduring reminder that the line between protector and perpetrator is often thinner than we dare to imagine. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into one of law enforcement's most tragic falls from grace. Remember to subscribe to True Crime Stories Archive for more compelling examinations of cases that challenge our understanding of justice, humanity, and the choices that shape our lives.